Okay, so removing the transmission in a 8th gen Civic Si. First step is to get it jacked up as high as you can. I got it on jack stands right now. I used this jack here underneath the front of the subframe, maxed it out, and got those jacks parallel with each other as high as they could go. And next step, we're going to remove the wheels. Okay, so I've got the transmission oil drained, got the wheels off. I drained it before at my apartment garage with the transmission oil in it, and a bunch of metal was stuck to the magnetic drain plug. So I just threw some cheap Walmart 10W30 motor oil in the transmission to get it on the trailer to get it back home. So now I'm going to work on taking the intake off, trying to get the battery out, undoing the surge tank, probably undoing the front motor mount, taking the shroud off from underneath the bumper, and getting some things taken off so we can move forward here. Okay, so I got the front bumper off. I took off the front shroud underneath the bumper, that other plastic piece. I'll show you where I put them over here. There's the bumper, and there's the shroud piece underneath it. Now I'm going to work from the top. I'm going to work on taking the intake off, as well as the aftercool surge tank, getting the shift linkage off the top of the transmission. I also need to remove the battery way down there. It's a brand new battery, actually. It got replaced under warranty, and I just put it in like a week before I broke the transmission, so that's going to come out again. So a quick look at underneath the car. Pulled the little shield that hides your flywheel. I'm going to have to take off the front mount, which is my Boomba red aluminum motor mount. This here in front of me is a subframe. Okay, and now I have the intake out. I put some painter's tape and wrapped it around the throttle body so that stays clean inside when I'm working on this. I got the intake over here. Like I said, I did painter's tape around each side to seal off the mass airflow sensor. And there's my hybrid racing intake with the AAM dry flow pre-filter over it. Those are just the components to that. Here's a little custom aluminum bracket I made to support the intake when it's in there. It's secured off of the bolt that is on the front location for the hybrid racing battery tray. So that kind of gives it support so it doesn't sag down. And I'm going to work on getting the battery out now, and then getting the shift linkage off the top, as well as the aftercooler surge tank. Kind of push that to the side because I don't want to drain the fluid out. So yeah, stay tuned. Alright, so the battery is out. I don't recommend flipping your afterflow tank upside down when you're pulling that out. That spilled everywhere and caused me a delay trying to clean it up all over the floor and the chassis. But the battery's out. I'm going to pull the battery tray. There's brackets attached to it, as you can see there. It's a little bit better of a view now. I'm going to pull the aftercool surge tank like I said earlier, and keep going at it. Okay, I'm back here. What we got going on is I got started taking off the main shifter cable. I got to take this other one off. I got the clip off of it, but it doesn't want to slide out because it doesn't have a spherical bushing on it like the other one. There's not enough play in the shafts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out the 3 bolts that hold down the shifter mechanism to the transmission, and that way I'll be able to move the cables off to the side. There's the 2 bolts right there, as you can see, and the third one is right there with my fingers touching. I don't know if you can see it in the camera. So those 3 will move that shift linkage out of the way. The other thing you want to do is unplug the sensor on the front of the transmission down here. That's unplugged. You're going to want to undo your ground. I had my battery grounded here for the hybrid racing intake, battery relocation. So you're going to want to take this ground off as well. And this is your transmission mount. Okay, so now I got the shift linkage off. Like I said, it was just those 3 bolts that went right here, here, and then to the left there. The longer bolt goes on the top left hole in this image here. So another thing I did was I unplugged the sensor right there. That's the connector for it right there. And then, like I said earlier, that connector is unplugged from the front of the transmission. And I still have to do that ground piece right there. Then we're going to go underneath the car after all that's done. One thing I forgot to mention is there's another sensor on top of the transmission, which I almost didn't see, that you have to unplug before you drop the transmission, so be sure you do it It's this gray plug right here. It's kind of hidden underneath where all your wiring harness is, so I didn't see it at first. And it's underneath that red hose there is for my boost, the boost gauge tube, as well as the clutch line. The clutch fluid line runs in the other red tube right below it, so make sure you undo that before you get any further. Okay, so we're back at it in the morning. The other thing I did is I took off the front motor mount. Okay, so next thing I did was I removed the rear motor mount bolts. There's a longer one and a shorter one. The longer one goes vertically into the subframe. The shorter one goes horizontally into the aluminum block on the engine here. And so this is all loose. Okay, so these are the two bolts that hold the center of the steering rack in place. They're the 17 millimeter hex heads. You're going to want to take both of those out. It's kind of tricky to get to them. There's a bracket right here. The 17 millimeter hex head bolt comes out, and this pivots once you loosen up the 14 millimeter hex head bolt next to it, and you slide it out of the way so the steering rack, or so you can drop the subframe without taking out the steering rack as well. You gotta just find a way to hold up the steering rack with like bungee cords or something. Alright, and then the one on the back side of the steering rack, right here is your header, and there's your primary O2. It's this bracket right here. It flips over the steering rack like so. I know it's kind of hard to see. I don't have the best lighting down here. But then you take the 17 millimeter bolt out of the top of here, loosen the 14 on the other side over there, and then you want to flip these out of the way so when you drop the subframe it doesn't try to pull the steering rack down with it. The only other two bolts you need to undo, as I showed earlier, are the ones that hold this collar down on the steering rack. They're 14 millimeter hex head bolts, and once those are taken off, this should be able to move freely off the top of the steering rack, so that allows the subframe to drop like I said earlier. And so next thing we're going to have to do is break the axle nuts loose, and then break all the bolts loose holding on the lower control arms. The front motor mounts out, the rear motor mounts out, the steering rack's all disconnected now. So we should be getting close to dropping the subframe. Okay, so we took off the axle nuts using the, make sure you use the 36 millimeter 6-point socket. Those zipped right off the end. Make sure you take those off before you try to drop the subframe. Underneath the car, we just got to take off these two nuts right here, and the bolt right here on each side for each A-arm. And we have the power steering rack all loosened up. We took the shield off from the intermediate shaft axle up in there. There's 3 bolts for that. They're 14 millimeter heads. We're getting ready to drop the subframe now. I did loosen up the 2 side bolts. There's 6 bolts that hold in the subframe. I loosened up these ones that go horizontal with the car's axis. I loosened those up on each side, and the 4 that are remaining are the ones on the corners. I think they're a 19 millimeter head or a 17. Okay, so to support the power steering rack, we kind of ran these ratchet straps around the ends of the tie rod. If you can see down there, I have it hooked right on the end of the tie rod past the boot, and then we ran it straight up, and I kind of hooked it off these drain holes here on the right side. And on the passenger side, we kind of tapped a zip tie off of the brace for the windshield wipers and ran a strap from there. I'll show you on the other end. It's right down. That's how it is on each side. So hopefully that'll be enough to support the power steering rack when we get ready to drop the subframe right now. Alright, so we took the 4 bolts to the subframe out in each corner, and we're slowly lowering it down. The only thing you got to be careful of is you want to pop your steering knuckle off the bottom A-arm. It kind of hangs up on those bolts. You're going to have to use 2 jacks. You don't have to, but we did. One on the front, one on the back, just to support the weight, and lower them down slowly, checking to make sure the steering rack is still being held up and nothing's hanging up on it. And just keep working each side down, like so. To the front. And the back again. And Voila, your subframe's out. So you got your subframe out now. We kind of moved it over to the side out of the garage. We're going to degrease it and pressure wash it and get it all cleaned up. These are the brackets I was talking about that hold down your power steering rack. The 17mm head bolts go through it, and then these are the 14mm head bolts. You just loosen those, you flip the brackets out of the way. You have your power steering rack wires that come down. This is your passenger side kind of collar that comes down and locks on it. There's like 4 wiring harnesses that sit on that, and they run down into this channel. You're going to have to cut this zip tie loose or pop it out. We just cut it, run the wires through here, and then the wires come up here, and this is where your electronic power steering unit is. These are the last 2 bolts on the subframe that we loosened. They kind of fit in a channel up on when you slide it down, so I just loosened those, left those in. You don't need to take your sway bar off. You leave that on as long as you take your lower control arms off with the subframe when you drop it. Alright, so I'm going to show you a quick view underneath the car with the subframe out. It's a ton more room. So you can see your transmission's got nothing in the way now. This is my first time seeing it as well. We got here's our ratchet straps holding up on the ends of the tie rods for the power steering rack. This is the collar I was talking about from the subframe. That's where all the wires are. And there's a few zip-tied spots on your subframe where you got to pop out so to make sure it doesn't drag the steering rack down when you drop the subframe. And that's our other ratchet strap holding it up. So you can get to your axle a lot better with the subframe out. And I'm just going to give you guys another view. There's your axle, your driver's side axle, power steering unit, passenger side axle. Alright, so we just popped the axle loose with a pry bar against the transmission in between a little crack there. So now you're just going to try to get it out. Slide it out of the knuckle. It's not coming. There it is. And there's your driver's side axle. Alright, next step, transmission. Alright, so with the subframe out, now we're moving on to the transmission jack. We got our cherry picker here, and we got it set up to mount on the 3 tabs for the transmission. One there, one down there, and then one in the back. There's 3 mounting tabs. And we took the 2 brackets, or the 2 bolts out for the ECU, so we get some room. We need to drop this mount as well as this one. And there's a bracket, or there's a bolt that's really hard to get behind the ECU. It sits pretty much straight down from here with a 14mm head. So now we're just going to remove these 2 17mm heads, and then there's one here, and then there's a bolt right back here. And those 3 connect to the transmission, and then take the 2 bolts out that hold this mount to the frame rail. One back there and one here behind this bracket. As you can see it in there. Alright, so this is what the transmission mount looks like. You don't need to take this bolt out off the top. You just need to take these 2 off the frame, which I'll show you here in a second, and then there's 3 bolts that go into the transmission. There's one regular bolt and then 2 studs with a nut on them. One of them is on the back there, and then the front right there. And the 2 that secure to the frame, they're kind of tricky to get to. The one of them's right in there, so you got to take this apart. And there's like I said, there's a 14mm hex head behind this that's really hard to get to. And then your back mount is right there. So now the mount is off the transmission. We actually pulled one stud out. The nut didn't break loose. The stud just came with it. The one back there. So we have 8 bolts to take off the transmission case. They're all loose, and we just got to back them out now. This bolt I'm taking out right now is a 17mm head. It goes through the bottom of the starter. It's one of the 2 bolts that hold the starter on, so it's the bottom one. That's number 1 of 8. The next one is right here. that goes into the opposite way. Alright, so we got 7 of the 8 bolts out around the transmission case. Make sure you label them because they're all different when you pull them out, so you want to put them back in the same spot. This one's the hardest to see. It's underneath basically where your giant coolant hose goes into the block up top here. And the ratchet, you need an extension to get to it. It's another, so 2 of the bolts for the casing are 14mm heads, and 6 of them are 17. And there's the 8th bolt. The only thing keeping it on now is the shaft going through it. Alright, so finally we were able to wrestle the transmission out. It was quite a pain to wiggle it around in there and break it loose and get it off the shaft to get it down, but we had the one ground was still on the frame, causing a little bit of an issue. And you want to you don't want to put your mounts on top of the transmission to the top tab. You want to keep your mounts on the back and the front, so it allows you to kind of pivot it. So you want to pivot it, the back end of the transmission, towards the ground so you can clear the frame rail. So I want to give you guys a quick look underneath the car while we're down here. There's my Exetti Stage 1 clutch pressure plate. Had the OEM flywheel resurfaced. If you've been following my videos, that was all brand new in August of last year, and there's probably not even 2,000 miles on it. There's my NVIDIA header, and this just shows how much room you have under the car when you have your subframe out. Steering rack still being held up. There's a jack to support the weight of the engine because only one mount is holding the engine, and that's the passenger side mount. Here's the transmission. A quick look at it. Alright guys, so I'm back here at my apartment complex. I'm currently editing the video for the transmission removal. I just wanted to make sure a couple things were noted. I did stop the video in a couple points and add in a few text slides saying that to make sure to support the engine oil pan before you start removing the transmission. That's a good point to make, and I forgot to mention it in the video. So make sure you do that, because at that point the only 2 mounts holding up the weight of your engine and transmission are the passenger side engine mount and that transmission mount. So if you're going to start taking that transmission mount off before you put the jack under the oil pan, the whole thing's going to start to fall, and that's going to be bad news. So just a key step is to make sure that you support the weight before you go to remove the transmission. Also, another video clip I didn't get in there just because I was working and my hands were filthy is when you're removing the passenger side axle, there's 3 bolts that hold the collar from the intermediate shaft to the block of the engine. The actual axle that connects to the hub on your passenger side, that is connected to the intermediate shaft through that collar, and you don't have to separate those 2. You leave those 2 together. You just can take the 3 bolts out that hold it to the engine, and you can slide out the intermediate shaft from the transmission at that point. I didn't even have to use a pry bar, it just slid right out with my hands, so that was pretty easy. The video clip I showed you of me removing an axle was the driver's side, so it's a similar process, just you got to take that collar off first before you go to pull it out of the transmission. So I hope this video helped to anyone out there with a blown up K20 Z3 transmission. I hope this video will help guide you and attack this yourself as opposed to paying a shop to do it. This is a second time the transmission's been out of the car. It's my first time attempting to take it out, so I went very slow with it. It took me about, I would say, 10 hours from start to finish to get it out. I take my time with these kind of things. I did it mostly by myself. The only help I had was towards the end when I was lowering the transmission. My father stepped in to help with that. But for the most part, it is a job you can do yourself. Just make sure you have the tools available. But it's definitely a doable job in your garage if you have a couple jacks and jack stands. So thanks for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time.